In the quiet corner of a bustling city, there was a small, unassuming bookstore. Its dusty shelves were lined with books that held stories of every kind, from the most whimsical fairy tales to the darkest of human desires. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as a young woman named Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes scanning the shelves for her next escape. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple, yet elegant, white blouse and blue jeans. The scent of aged paper and ink filled the air, and the soft murmur of distant traffic served as a soothing backdrop to her solitude. Evelyn had a secret love for the darker, more taboo genres, stories that made her heart race and her cheeks flush. She felt a thrill of excitement as her fingers traced over the spines of books, searching for something that would truly satisfy her craving for the unusual. Her eyes fell upon a leather-bound volume titled The Art of Submission and Dominance. It was tucked away in a section she had never noticed before, hidden behind a row of romance novels as if it were a treasure waiting to be discovered. The book was heavy in her hands, the pages thick and filled with the wisdom of generations. It spoke of a world where power and passion danced together in a delicate, often twisted, ballet. As she read, her heart began to race, her breath shallow. The words on the pages painted vivid images in her mind, images of a life where she was in complete control. "Evelyn," a voice called out, snapping her back to reality. She looked up to see her husband, Thomas, standing by the counter. His eyes held a look of concern, but there was something else in them, fear, perhaps. He had always been a timid man, and she knew he had no interest in the desires that stirred within her. She forced a smile, slipping the book back onto the shelf. "Ready to go?" "Almost," she said, her voice a little too eager. "I just found something interesting." She stepped closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. In that moment, she knew that the pages of that book were not just for reading, they were a map to the life she was meant to live. And she was ready to start her journey. That night, as Thomas lay sleeping beside her, Evelyn couldn't shake the images from her mind. The idea of bending him to her will, making him her devoted servant, had taken root in her thoughts. She knew he would never understand her desires, never agree to the transformation she craved. But she had to try. The next day, Evelyn began subtly testing the waters. She started with simple commands, asking Thomas to rub her feet after a long day at work, then to kiss them, and finally to worship them. To her surprise, he complied, albeit with a hint of confusion. Each step further into her newfound world of dominance brought a thrill that washed away the last remnants of doubt. Thomas, for his part, found the changes in their relationship as baffling as they were arousing. He had always loved Evelyn, and her sudden demand for his adoration was something he found oddly satisfying. He didn't question it, not at first. He was just happy to see her happy, to feel the warmth of her smile when he knelt before her. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Evelyn's desires grew more intense. The book had taught her patience, had shown her how to manipulate and coerce. Soon, Thomas was not just her foot slave, but her cuckold as well. He watched, a mix of horror and fascination, as she invited other men into their home, into their bed, all the while keeping him firmly in his place. The power dynamic had shifted, and Thomas, once her loving husband, had become something else entirely, a tool for her pleasure, a spectator to her conquests, and yet, through it all, a part of him reveled in his degradation. He found himself getting off on the humiliation, the way she used him and discarded him, only to bring him back for more. It was a cycle that neither of them could break, a dance of power and submission that had consumed them both. Their relationship had become a tapestry of dark threads, woven into a pattern that neither had anticipated. But as Evelyn looked into the mirror, her reflection staring back with cold, calculating eyes, she knew that she had only just begun. Her hunger for control was insatiable, and she would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. One evening, as Thomas lay prostrate before her, his face buried in her feet, she decided it was time to take things to the next level. "Look at me," she ordered, her voice low and commanding. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and she could see the fear and longing in his eyes. "You will no longer be enough for me," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "From now on, you will watch as I take my pleasure from others." The first time she brought another man home, Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He could smell the faint scent of the man's cologne, feel the tension in the air like a living entity. But as he watched from the shadows, as the stranger's hands touched his wife's body in ways he never had the courage to, something strange happened. He found himself getting hard, his mind racing with thoughts of what it would be like to see her with another man. The encounters grew more frequent, and with each one, Thomas's role diminished further. He became the one who set the stage for her trysts, arranging the room to her specifications, serving her and her lovers drinks, and even cleaning up after they were done. He was no longer a participant, but an observer, a silent witness to her sexual conquests. And as the weeks turned into months, he realized that his role as a cuckold was not just a part of their life, it was their life. The other men knew of his existence, of course. They knew he was there, watching them take what was rightfully his. But they didn't care. They reveled in the power they had over him, whispering crude things about his inadequacies as a man as they used his wife. And Evelyn? She reveled in it too. The power she held over both her husband and her lovers was intoxicating, and she had no intention of letting go. The sound of their moans and gasps filled the room, a symphony of pleasure that Thomas could never truly be a part of. He watched as she writhed beneath them, her eyes closed in ecstasy. He felt a pang of jealousy, of anger, but it was quickly drowned out by his own arousal. He had become a spectator in his own marriage, a servant to her desires. And as he listened to the rhythmic slap of skin on skin, the wet sounds of her being filled, he knew that he was exactly where she wanted him to be. Evelyn had grown bolder, inviting more than one man at a time to satisfy her. They used him as a prop, a human chair for her to rest on as they took turns pleasuring her. She would look at him, a smug smile playing on her lips, daring him to say something, to put a stop to it. But he never did. He was too far gone, too deep in his role as her devoted servant, her cuckold. Thomas found himself cleaning up after their encounters with a strange sense of pride. He would wash the stains from the bed, fold the used condoms into neat little packages, and even help her shower off the sweat and cum. It was a twisted form of intimacy, one that made him feel both pathetic and powerful. He knew that he was essential to her pleasure, that without him, she wouldn't be able to indulge in her dark fantasies. One night, as they lay in bed together, Thomas felt a hand on his chest. He looked up to see Evelyn staring down at him, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "You're mine," she said, her voice a seductive purr. "All of you. And I'm going to keep pushing your boundaries until you can't take it anymore." He swallowed hard, his cock already responding to her words. "But," she continued, "you're going to have to do something for me." The request was simple, yet it shook him to his core. She wanted him to bring her new men, to find those who would satisfy her cravings. It was a task that both terrified and excited him. He knew it meant delving deeper into the world of submission, of watching his wife be used by strangers. But he also knew that it meant he was still important to her, that she still needed him. The following week saw Thomas scouring the internet, searching for those who shared his wife's tastes. He set up profiles, sent messages, and made plans, always under her watchful eye. The anticipation was almost too much to bear. He found himself getting off on the idea of hand-picking her lovers, of watching them take her in ways he never could, and when the day finally came, when the doorbell rang and he led the first of her conquests into their home, he felt his heart race like never before. He watched as Evelyn's eyes lit up, as she surveyed the man before her, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The line between love and obsession had been blurred beyond recognition, and he was willingly walking into the dark unknown, hand in hand with the woman who had made him her willing captive. Thomas had chosen well. The man was tall, muscular, and exuded a confidence that Thomas had never known. His eyes raked over Evelyn's body with a hunger that made Thomas's stomach clench. He felt a strange mix of anger and arousal as he offered the man a drink, his own hand shaking slightly. He could feel the power in the air, thick and palpable, as Evelyn led the stranger into their bedroom, her hips swaying with an allure that was undeniable. The sounds that followed were like nothing Thomas had ever heard before. The low murmurs of seduction, the squeaks of the bed, and the unmistakable sounds of pleasure. He sat on the couch, his erection painfully obvious, his mind racing with images of his wife's body being claimed by another. The humiliation was overwhelming, and yet he couldn't tear himself away. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making, a cycle of submission and desire. As the months passed, the men grew bolder. They didn't just come to their home anymore, they picked her up from work, took her out to dinner, and brought her back to fuck her in front of him. Thomas was forced to watch as his wife became more and more unattainable, her pleasure becoming something that only others could give her. Yet, every time she looked at him with those hungry eyes, every time she whispered his name through gritted teeth as she climaxed, he felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. He was the puppet master, orchestrating her downfall, even as he was the one truly falling apart. The tension in their home was palpable, a living, breathing entity that fed on their twisted love. They didn't speak of it, didn't acknowledge the change that had taken place. They simply existed in this new dynamic, dancing around each other with a delicate balance of power and submission. But as the years went on, Thomas began to feel the strain. The cracks in their marriage grew wider, and he wondered if they would ever find their way back to each other, if he even wanted to. The final straw came when Evelyn announced she was pregnant. Thomas knew it wasn't his, the timing was all wrong. But as he looked into her eyes, filled with a fiery determination, he realized that she had never been more alive than in that moment. The child growing inside her was a symbol of her dominance, a living, breathing testament to her power over him. And in that instant, he knew that their lives would never be the same. The pregnancy only served to fuel her desires. She grew more demanding, more insatiable. And with each passing day, Thomas felt himself slipping further and further away from the man he once was. He had become a mere shadow of his former self, living in the wake of her hedonistic appetites. But as he watched her belly swell with the child that wasn't his, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. She had conquered him completely, turned him into the cuckold he never knew he wanted to be. And as he felt the baby kick for the first time, a twisted love grew in his heart. He would love the child, raise it as his own, because it was a part of her. And in the end, wasn't that all that mattered? The birth was a blur of pain and pleasure, of screams and sweat. And as he held the squalling newborn in his arms, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. This was his punishment, his penance for failing her. He had given her everything she wanted, and in return, she had given him a purpose. To serve, to submit, to be there for her in every way she needed. Their life was far from normal, but it was theirs. And as they stared into the eyes of the child that bound them forever in this twisted dance of dominance and submission, Thomas knew that he would never be free. But he also knew that he didn't want to be. He was hers, utterly and completely, and as he kissed her swollen feet, he whispered his love for her. The story didn't end there. It was merely a chapter in the saga of their life together. For in the world of power and pleasure, there was always more to explore, more lines to cross, and more boundaries to push. And as long as Evelyn held the reins, Thomas would follow, eager to please. Evelyn grew more ambitious in her cuckolding escapades. She started posting ads online, seeking out the most virile and dominant men to satisfy her cravings. Men who didn't just take her, but men who would use her as she had used Thomas. She wanted them to show her husband what a real man was capable of, to make him feel smaller and more insignificant with each thrust. Thomas, in his unwavering loyalty, became her recruiter. He'd screen potential candidates, arranging meetings, and even going so far as to watch them together before deciding if they were worthy of her attention. It was a strange twist of fate that had turned him into both her protector and her pimp, but he reveled in the power he had over her lovers, even as he knew he had none over her. The baby grew into a toddler, a chubby-cheeked little boy with his mother's mischievous smile. Thomas took to his role as a father with surprising ease, his love for the child overshadowing the anger he felt towards the men who had fathered him. He would watch from the corner of the room as Evelyn played with their son, her belly still swollen with another man's seed, and feel a strange sense of pride. This was his family now, as twisted and unconventional as it may be, but the dynamic grew stale for Evelyn. She needed something more, something that would light the fire in her belly and remind her of why she had started down this path in the first place. And so, she began to introduce new elements into their games, pushing Thomas further than ever before. One evening, she told him to get dressed. They were going out, she said, to a place where she could truly be herself. Thomas obeyed, his heart racing as he slipped into the outfit she had laid out for him, a pair of tight, lacy panties and a silk blouse that barely contained his breasts. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a vice. But he followed her, ready to face whatever she had in store. The club was a cacophony of lights and sound, the air thick with the scent of lust and desperation. Evelyn strutted in like she owned the place, her eyes scanning the crowd for her next conquest. Thomas trailed behind her, his face flushed with a mix of fear and excitement. He had never felt so exposed, so feminine. And yet, the looks of the men and women around them, the way they stared at him with a mix of curiosity and hunger, only served to excite him more. The night grew darker, the games more intense. Evelyn danced with a group of men, her body moving in ways that made Thomas's knees weak. And as one of them leaned in to whisper something in her ear, she turned to him and winked, a silent invitation for him to watch. The man took her hand and led her to a private room, and Thomas followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The door closed behind them, and he was left outside, his ears filled with the muffled sounds of passion. He slid to the floor, his back against the cold, unforgiving wood, and listened as his wife was taken by another man. And in that moment, as he sat there in his lingerie, listening to the sounds of his own humiliation, he knew that he had reached a new level of submission. He had become not just a foot slave, not just a cuckold, but a willing participant in his own degradation. And as he felt the first trickle of cum stain the silk of his blouse, he also knew that he had never been more alive. The months passed, and Thomas found himself slipping further and further into the role of the obedient sissy husband. He learned to walk in heels, to apply makeup, and even to take care of his wife's every need, from the mundane to the deeply intimate. He was her servant, her plaything, and he loved every minute of it. But even as he reveled in his newfound identity, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she wanted from him. Something that would test the very limits of his love and devotion. And when she finally told him what it was, his heart stopped in his chest. Evelyn had found a new interest in the BDSM community. She had been attending classes, learning new techniques, and making connections that would push their relationship into uncharted territory. One evening, she presented Thomas with a leather collar and a set of instructions. He was to wear it at all times, a symbol of his complete and utter submission to her. Thomas swallowed hard as he fastened the collar around his neck. The cold metal was a stark reminder of his place in their twisted dance, a reminder that no matter how much he had given, she would always demand more. But he didn't hesitate. He knew that this was what she needed, what she craved. And so, he became her devoted pet, her human toy to be used and displayed as she saw fit. The private club was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. The walls were lined with whips, chains, and leather contraptions that looked more like instruments of torture than tools of pleasure. The air was thick with the scent of leather and sex, and the sounds of moans and whips echoed through the halls. Evelyn strutted in like she owned the place, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Thomas followed her, his heart racing in his chest, the collar a constant reminder of his submission. She led him to a stage, where a crowd of masked figures watched with eager anticipation. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their hunger. Tonight, she announced to the crowd, her voice a siren's call, my husband will serve as an example of true love and devotion. He will submit to whatever I command, no matter how humiliating, no matter how painful. The crowd murmured in approval, and Thomas felt a thrill run through his body. He was terrified and excited in equal measure, his mind racing with the possibilities. He knew he was about to be pushed further than he ever had been before, but he also knew that he would come out of it stronger, more devoted than ever. The first command was simple enough, to strip before the audience. Thomas's hands trembled as he removed his clothing, but he did as he was told. He felt the cool air kiss his skin, the eyes of the spectators burning into him as he stood before them, naked and exposed. But it was the second command that truly tested him. Evelyn instructed him to kneel before her, to present himself to her as she sat in a throne-like chair, surrounded by her lovers. He felt the leather bite into his knees as he obeyed, his cock hardening despite his fear. One by one, her lovers approached, each one taking a turn to spit in his face, to slap him, to use him as a human ashtray. The crowd watched, their eyes gleaming with excitement. And through it all, Thomas felt a strange sense of pride, a perverse thrill that he could give her what she needed. But the final command was one that he never saw coming. She told him to crawl through the crowd, to beg each and every one of them to use him, to treat him like the worthless cuckold he was. And as he looked up at her, his face wet with spit and tears, he knew that this was it, this was the ultimate act of submission. With a nod, he began his journey through the sea of leather and latex, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so vulnerable, so small, so utterly at her mercy. And as he felt the hands of strangers on his body, as he heard their cruel laughter, he knew that he had reached the pinnacle of his transformation. The night ended with him in a cage, watching as his wife and her lovers played out their darkest desires before him. He was no longer Thomas, the husband and father, but a creature of pure lust and submission, living only to serve her whims. And as he lay there, the sounds of their passion ringing in his ears, he realized that he had never been happier. For in the depths of his humiliation, he had found a love that was stronger than anything he had ever known, a love that was as dark as it was beautiful, as twisted as it was pure. Their story continued, each new chapter more intense than the last. They explored the darkest recesses of human desire, pushing themselves to the brink and back again. And through it all, the bond between them grew stronger.